to endorse and a Green Collegiate Professor of Law at the University of Michigan Law School, where she is also founder and director of the Civil Rights Litigation Clearance House. She teaches constitutional law, torts, and courses related to civil rights and to prisons. In 2010 and 2011, she was the presidentially appointed officer for civil rights and civil liberties at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, where she was lead advisor to Secretary Janet Napolitano. Jenner is a putative class counsel in Iraqi Detention, the federal lawsuit, and that I mentioned previously, which we'll be talking about as a suit. And finally, Susan Reed is a managing attorney of the Michigan Iraqi Center. She previously worked as a staff attorney at Farm Worker Legal Services of Michigan and is a regional attorney for Justice Department University. Susan is the secretary of the steering committee for the Michigan Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights and was appointed by the Michigan Supreme Court to the Foreign Language Board of Review as the LEP Populations Advocate. And she served as a committee member of the Court's Limited English Proficiency Implementation Advisory Committee. Susan's also a member of the Detroit City Council Immigration Task Force, and she's going to give us some background on immigrant rights, state immigrant rights in Michigan generally, and access to services. So I'm going to turn it over to our speakers.
Thank you, Sabrina, and thank you to the Levin Center and Wayne State Law for having me. I was actually an undergraduate student and a law student here, so it's exciting to be back in a different context. So I'm going to give a brief background on the Chaldean Assyrian community, which comprised of most of the detainees back in June. The Chaldean Assyrian community resettled here in Metro Detroit in waves beginning in the early 20th century. The largest wave happened in the 70s. There was a lot of political unrest in the region, and the Christians, the minority there, saw a lot of struggle coming, especially with the Iraq war, and decided to immigrate to the United States. There was a lot of angst and worry about the political party there, and so that's when the first wave happened. We also saw a large wave post-2003 invasion of Iraq, and it's also continuing after the ISIS invasion in 2014. The initial wave was in Detroit. A lot of Chaldeans resettled in the California area as well. There are currently about 160,000 Chaldean Assyrians in Metro Detroit. They were mainly known for their work in the retail store industry, and the second and third generations are diversifying their career orientations. So Chaldean Assyrians have had a history of being victims of genocide, especially with the most recent ISIS invasion of Iraq. The last administration declared that it was a genocide in Iraq, and this administration actually affirmed it in the spring. America and other Western countries have provided a safe haven for the Chaldean Assyrians, but with the ongoing conflict in the Middle East, there's extreme fear amongst the community that the community will soon be extinct. In June of this summer, there was a massive roundup of Iraqi nationals in the Metro Detroit area. Around 114 Iraqi nationals were picked up and detained by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and it was a sort of shock to the community. For lack of a better term, there were rumors going around in April that Iraq and the United States had some type of agreement going on that Iraq would start to repatriate Iraqi nationals as sort of a quid pro quo to remove Iraq off the travel ban list that was put in place by the Trump administration. Again, it was rumored, no one really thought it to be true. So on June 11th, it was a big shock when we started getting phone calls and Facebook messages and text messages that families, fathers, mothers were being picked up, getting ready for church on Sunday, in their homes, in their cars, at work. And we decided that we had to take some type of action. So around 6 p.m., we opened our doors at Code Legal Aid to service a type of command center for these families. We were getting hundreds and hundreds of phone calls and flooding into our offices, and we knew that we needed some place where people could go for information, and in return we could also take information to see what necessary steps we need to continue forward. So at around 6 p.m. we opened our doors. We probably received around 100 families. We did not leave our offices until 5 a.m. in the morning. We immediately got on the phone with civil rights organizations, the Michigan Immigrant Rights Center, the ACLU, International Refugee Assistance Project, and luckily they were able to be at the forefront of this because we were hearing, that a plane would be leaving as soon as the same week that they were picked up. So we had a few tasks at hand that we had to approach. The first was, is the plane really leaving? What can we do to stop this? And the second was, does everyone have an attorney? And if they don't have an attorney, what can we do to make sure that everyone has access to representation and actually gets it as well? So basically we started by taking information from all the families. And we asked basic questions, who's your loved one? Do they have a final order of removal? Do they have a criminal history? Basic background information, their religious affiliation, things like that. And we were able to gather all the information needed for the ACLU to file the complaint that successfully halted the deportation. Our next task was to make sure that everyone, or at least everyone, can get an attorney. Most of these families did not have access to finances to hire an attorney, and a lot of these fees were $5,000, $10,000, even $15,000 to even retain. A lot of work goes into, a lot of these cases, but what we really wanted to do was making sure that everyone who had an attorney could file an emergency stay so that they could get in, so that we would know that they would not be on a plane anytime soon at least. So we successfully hired 80, we successfully got about 80 people, attorneys in that 1 or 2 months. It was a very difficult time, but luckily we had a lot of volunteers, a lot of volunteer lawyers, and a lot of volunteer organizations that helped take this task on. So since then, we've been involved in the federal litigation with the ACLU, and we're still focusing on retaining counsel for those who just don't have the finances to, retain their own.
Like everybody else, I'm really grateful to be here. Thank you all. And thanks to the Levin Center. So, I got brought into the model litigation as it was just getting started. We had an emergency meeting with the Chaldean community about what could possibly be done. And we began, I'm in the litigation as a cooperating attorney with the ACLU. We began to think through what the thing could possibly be. The first way of thinking about it, that where we started, was the basic idea that the United States law forbids people to be deported into persecution and torture. And then, particularly, it's a fairly easy case to make that the Chaldean community in particular, which had this State Department announcement that what they were facing in Iraq was genocide, that the idea of sending them back there to a country that many of them had left decades before, some of them don't speak the language, many came here as toddlers. A few have never been to Iraq. They were born in refugee camps elsewhere. So the idea of sending those people back to Iraq, that would violate the INA and the Detention against torture. So that's kind of idea number one. Idea number two is that if there's a right, if somebody has a liberty interest or right somehow, that they are entitled to a meaningful opportunity to have a meaningful hearing on that right. And therefore, then telling people that they're going to be on a plane tomorrow violates their due process rights, which are subsidiary to their right not to be sent back to persecution and torture. And so we have a due process right. And that's the basic 1-2 punch of the model litigation in what was its first phase. So the idea was to persuade the federal court that, notwithstanding a statute that appears to bar federal jurisdiction, that nonetheless it was available to the federal court to stay removal first for long enough that the judge could get his head around what were quite complex issues. And we won that one very fast. The judge said, I'm going to have a stay of removal while I decide my And then to stay removed long enough to get the class members, which is 300 Iraqi nationals around the country, about 140 of them are from Metro Detroit, more or less. Probably over 100 of them are Chaldean, but that leaves 200 who are probably not Chaldean and 160 who are not from Detroit. Nationwide, a stay of removal to give them long enough to get lawyers and get into immigration court to reopen their cases and assert their rights under the Immigration and Nationality Act, vote. And so we won that stay, the one that was long enough lasting, that everyone could actually go back into their communities, their families could go into their communities and try to find lawyers. We won that stay on July 24th. And the effort since then has been to get these 300 folks lawyers and a hearing and get their cases reopened. So far, out of the 300, 150-ish, 160 have filed motions to reopen their cases. Out of those, 75 are litigated to completion, and out of those, 65 have led to reopened cases. So 65 out of 75, my numbers are a tiny bit off, forgive me. I'm saying them with great definiteness, and each one of them is going to be off by one or two. But there's a declaration that I swore out, which actually has the numbers right, which if anybody wants it, I have it. But the basic number is 87% of, and that one's for real, 87% of the MTRs, the motions to reopen, that have been litigated to conclusion in immigration court, 87% of those people had their cases reopened. Out of the people whose cases have been reopened, only 10 have actually finished their cases in immigration court. So it's not very many. So I don't want to say that these trends will continue. But out of those 10 have won relief in immigration court. Because that's what happens when you go into immigration court with a claim that is as just as this and with decent lawyers. You win. That's the reason why the administration wants people to stay in detention and wants people not to have lawyers, because when people are out, when people have lawyers, they win their cases. So we're 10 for 10 right now, but that leaves 290 who aren't done yet, and we are working that case. So in the meantime, they've been in detention a pretty long time. A lot of them, most of the ones from Detroit have been in detention since June 11th, which is a pretty long time. And some people from some other communities have actually been in a little bit longer than that, and some, the ones who got out of prison and were put right into ICE detention, have been in detention over a year. People have been in detention a long time on these cases. And so, on Tuesday, this past Tuesday, we filed a second petition seeking more preliminary relief. In this particular one, we asked for release of all 295 people who are currently in detention. And the argument was that they're not going anywhere very soon. And therefore, what do you have them in detention for? Why do they need to be in detention? Their cases are going to take a long time. And if their cases are going to take a long time, let them out into the community. And when you're ready to deport them, if they're going to get deported, because remember, 87% have won reopening, and 100% of the ones who have gone to completion have actually won. If in the end you're going to be able to deport them, arrest them then. Why do you need to arrest them now? What are these people in detention for? Detention is a terrible place to be, and it's a terrible place to litigate a case from. It's both. It's bad for due process, and it's bad for health and humanity and families and economics. And so we have asked the federal judge, Judge Goldsmith, in the Eastern District of Michigan, to let them all go. Like his will be heard in mid-December, if all goes well, leading to the obvious slogan of home by Christmas. So we'll see what happens. In the meantime, we are litigating in 5-4, which is the most complex litigation I've ever been involved in. So we have a really complicated district court litigation in the Eastern District of Michigan. We have an appeal, because the government appealed that first PI to the Sixth Circuit, and that appeal, the first brief is due on that appeal in another 10 or 12 days by the government. So that's in the Sixth Circuit. We have over 100 cases in immigration court. Not that we're litigating all of those as the primary counsel, but the class has over 100 cases in immigration court on having reopened Catholic. We have about 90 cases in the Board of Immigration Appeals, the administrative appellate structure that deals with immigration law. About 90 cases in the Board of Immigration Appeals seeking reopening. And we have 7 cases in which, about fairly early on, these cases have unusual procedural postures, the Board of Immigration Appeals denied relief and they are up in the Sixth Circuit on the petition for review. In addition, there are 4 cases pending on habeas in courts scattered around the country, and we just started our first advocacy efforts with CBP for a few class members who are seeking reconsideration of their denial of credible fear by Customs and Border Protection. So that's actually more than 6 for depends how you count it, and we are in all of them. The group, the Hamama team, and we're having a little bit of separation anxiety sitting so far away from the team. We spend a lot of time together. The Hamama team is obviously litigating in federal court. We are helping find lawyers for immigration court and the BIA. We are working with the law firm Jenner & Block to consolidate or otherwise present some kind of proof evidence in the immigration court on the reopened cases on country conditions. That's an effort that I hope will yield some good results because people don't have enough money to hire their own experts. So sharing resources makes complete sense. The government, of course, is opposing that effort, but I'm hopeful on that one. So that's the immigration court, and so we're working that far. We've filed 97 amicus briefs in the Board of Immigration Appeals. And next week, we've enlisted the support of the Harvard Immigration Clinic, and they are planning to file 6 amicus briefs in the Sixth Circuit. And we're getting ready to brief the case out in the Sixth Circuit, and we're going to be arguing in district court right before Christmas. So I was reportedly on research leave this semester. I confess I've done a lot more research into how to solve a mass immigration, a mass deportation rate than I have into what I was thinking I was going to write for the semester. But that's what we're doing so far. It has been a massive effort, and it's beginning to have some copycat litigations elsewhere. I don't know if, in some ways I think that's awesome, because I think like the more people who can do some group litigation, the better. In some ways it's a little bit frightening because it makes ICE a little more plausible when they tell the judge in Detroit, boy, you're really messing with the system. Like, we want them to believe what I think is true, which is that the system can completely handle the strain we're putting on it, that the system is totally capable of reopening 300 cases out of the 400,000 people who get it.
Got close enough.
I guess. We think that it can handle it, but there's a copycat litigation in Boston about Indonesians. They're not in detention, but they are seeking a similar kind of a strategy. And I hear, although I don't know the details, that there are a couple others in the works elsewhere. So that I think is the sum total. It's been an organizational task like I've never been involved in, to be honest, in a litigation. It's a lot of people, and every one of them is potentially in all of those fora. It's a lot of people. It's a lot of lawyers. But every morning I do a few conversations with some lawyers to work some stuff, and so does Nadine, and so does Susan, and so does the cast of dozens who is on the team. And so far we're winning, and that's pretty great.
Yeah, well, I do want to say, for the sake of the heartburn that some self-proclaimed decent immigration lawyers like myself might have, we do sometimes lose in court, even with good claims in our decency.
Sorry.
But we certainly can win, and people have a much better chance, as we've learned throughout the day-to-day with us. I wanted to just comment a little bit on one of the early issues in the case, which was the government's basic position that these ethnic and religious minority groups, particularly Chaldeans of Iraqi nationality, have had a couple of years, since that genocide declaration, and some folks had already filed motions to reopen. And the government's basic position was, these people sat on their rights. So yeah, one Sunday night we went out and got them, but they sat on their rights and they're not deserving of any more process. And the statute doesn't envision it. And so one of the things that I was really proud to be able to bring was information for the court about the real status of access to justice and access to counsel in immigration-related issues in Michigan. And to give you a little bit of the background that I was able to share with the court about the state of affairs, is that in some ways my organization, which is part of a larger legal aid program with a 50-year history based in Ann Arbor, what's now the Michigan Advocacy Program, historically has been Legal Services of South Central Michigan. We started 9 years ago with just me trying to do some statewide coordination and cooperation. And we are about to add our 9th attorney, which is extremely exciting. And a lot of community organizing in immigration and immigrant rights has grown up, and like the incredible work that has happened among really young Wayne grads in the Chaldean community to put that community in the position they were in to have a code to call is great. And so there's much more immigrant rights infrastructure here than there was 10 years ago. There is still much less than in many other places, and there is not enough anywhere, as we know, except those very special 100% cities. But I think even those places are probably having a very intense public defense kind of experience around beginning to do this. But do take a look at the Vera Institute of Justice releases from yesterday about 10 more safe cities that are going to provide essentially universal representation in removal proceedings. Thanks to just, I'm just like gobsmacked by it. It's so awesome. But roughly, I had to calculate this out. I don't actually think it's in my declaration, and I should have put it in now that I realize it. Okay, we cleared that hurdle. There's basically one free or low-cost immigration attorney for every 25,000 low-income immigrants in the state of Michigan. Now, of course, not all those people are in removal proceedings, but of course, removal proceedings are not the only thing that those nonprofit attorneys are doing. And in fact, in Michigan, virtually no nonprofit attorneys are doing a significant amount of removal defense or detained work. Most people are doing family-based petitions and applications to USCIS because of really the sort of nonprofit economics and time economics of prioritizing that work. Merck has expanded our work in those areas, but we're still very limited. We did just receive notice that we received a grant from the Kresge Foundation to add 2 Detroit-focused attorneys. So we're proud of that, and yet at the same time, access is truly limited. And one thing that I was able to share with the court was that in addition to sort of the maybe market rate $5,000 to $15,000 cost of reopening, I did an informal survey as I was preparing to share information with the court, and one very well-known and reputable local practitioner told me that he wouldn't accept a case like this unless the client felt that they had about $80,000 to spend over the course of the representation. ICE has demanded to know who that attorney is in discovery.
And we will at some
appropriate point let them know. You know, that is the reality for so many families, and the reality on the ground really feels like it's a tax, right? A lot of really thoughtful writers talk about the black tax, right? Like the wealth that your family has not built, the costs that mass incarceration and other things impose, and really the immigrant tax has that added dimension of immigration lawyering, that call that you get because someone's uncle has been detained, and we have to come up with $10,000 for the attorney, and we have to come up with $10,000 for the bond. It becomes a tax that really entrenches generations of people in poverty. And not to take anything away from the very good private practitioners who need to be paid to sustain the work that they do. But it becomes a huge tax on the community, and that's why people were not necessarily sitting on their rights. but just didn't have access to the kind of lawyering that it was going to take to vindicate their rights.
Let me just add one thing, because I realize that in telling the story of this case, one thing that you may not have heard us say, but that is true, is that it has been decades since any significant number of Iraqis were repatriated to Iraq. Decades. That's not to say that nobody was ever repatriated to Iraq. People who had current passports were occasionally deported to Iraq. 2 dozen, 3 dozen, that kind of number a year. And people who had very, very recent lives in Iraq who lost in proceedings here or who failed to be granted asylum at the border. Those people were deported to Iraq. But in general, it's been the case for Iraqis and for people of certain other nationalities that when they were arrested, detained, and they take one stab at fixing their immigration status in detention, and they'd lose. And then the question came to them, well, what do you want to do? Do you want to say, okay, I'm out? You're not going to get deported. You're going to get released. You're going to be on an order of supervision, and you're going to still live here. But you'll have a final order of removal that no one will deport you on. Do you want to do that, or do you want to fight? By the way, if you fight, you're going to be in detention. And the fight will take a year and a half, 2 years. Which do you want to do? That for a lot of people didn't seem like a hard call, right? When they're in detention, they're not earning money to support their families. Their families are facing real deprivation, besides the deprivation of liberty that they are facing. And so a lot of people, some of them even conceded deportability. They didn't even fight their cases in the immigration court. They just said at the very first hearing, I'm done, I'm good, because they didn't think they'd be deported. And so this group, and Iraqis are not the only ones, but this group of people, their final orders of removal are particularly unreliable as an actual statement of what their underlying cases really looked like. Because what the United States government has decided to do, speaking of taxes, is to tax people who fight their deportation by keeping them in detention during that fight. Even though what that means is they can afford less well to pay their lawyers, they can't take care of their families, they can't find lawyers, it's hard to find a lawyer from detention, and they suffer all of the normal indignities of being in jail, because immigration detention is just like jail. I mean, it's not just like jail, it is jail. I mean, it's mostly in jails. It's jail. So the question is,
Where is it?
It's over at the jail.
right.
So when faced with something that says sign on the dotted line, you're admitting deportability, but you're never going to be deported, or stay and fight. That's the choice that we put people to, and it should be unsurprising that so many of them said, okay, fine, I'll sign on the dotted line. And then that they have actually good cases to make if they can just get those cases reopened. So, all right.
So thanks for all those initial thoughts from our panelists. I wanted to raise a question for everyone perhaps to respond to, and it's a critique that's emerged, a question asking why these arrests prompted a very deep community response and mobilization of the legal community, and why has this mobilization not occurred, for example, in the case of the Latino community in the area? A question that I think we all would like to respond to.
Well, I mean, I will respond that this case has gotten a lot of attention, and you can see the incredible talent and the really remarkable achievement of this team. And now everywhere I go in the state of Michigan and talk with immigrant communities, I get asked, why haven't you done that for us? You know, why haven't you called your friends at the ACLU to stop the pain and suffering that our community is going through? And I think most of this audience will have a beginning of an understanding about how that is, right? That you don't necessarily have like a similarly situated religious minority group facing an identified, sort of timeline on a genocide. You have a situation where they went out on a Sunday night and got everybody. I mean, not to give any tips, right? But if they had done this sort of a person a day, 5 people a day, it would just have looked.
I mean, there's a reason
Differently.
why the mobilization was in Detroit rather than in Nashville or Georgia or whatever, where it was 5, onesie, twosie.
Yeah, I mean, potential CAT eligibility is, obviously a huge factor. All those pieces are there, but I also will say that the extreme cohesiveness and organization level of the community, it is a factor in the ability to have a response like this. And it's not to say that if, another community got as organized or cohesive, we could have the same result. But I think it certainly was a factor. Senator Levin was very engaged with and supportive of the Chaldean community from, long before these detentions. And so that's a testament both to your advocacy, but also to the community's advocacy in communicating their needs.
Yeah, and just to add, I know we keep saying that the administration declared a genocide, and it's not really unusual for a president to say something and not act on it, but it was very unusual to see a president, talking about how we're going to save the Christians in Iraq, and we're going to make sure that no one dies in Iraq, and the Christians need to be saved there, and then to do the exact opposite and actually try to send them back to a place where they were really just kicked out of. And if it wasn't for the Michigan Immigrant Rights Center and all these other organizations, we would not know what to do. We have never been through this in my community. It was a real shock, and if it wasn't for looking to, our friends at the Michigan Immigrant Rights Center, IRAP, the ACLU, we would really be in a real struggle. And it's particularly unique because we've never really identified with the modern day immigration struggle. And I think, unfortunately, the circumstances are terrible in that sense. But also, it was really an enlightening period for the community to know that we need to look at other communities and see how we have similarities and we have struggles amongst each other. And we all once came from a different place. And I think that has been really important for me to see that, when other communities are struggling, we have to help them as well. Because if it wasn't for, the Hispanic community, the Muslim communities, the Jewish communities, we would not be able to accomplish what we have so far. So.
The only thing that I would add is that other immigrant communities have done massive and massively successful organizing in other realms, right? It isn't quite the same as this lawsuit, but the current sort of situation of the Dreamers which is, let me just say, although precarious, I actually think that in the end, maybe I shouldn't be so confident, but I think it's going to work out for them in the end. And that didn't just happen. That happened through organizing and through the kind of advocacy that particularly Latino communities have managed to kind of move mountains in terms of public opinion and the politics and so on. And when the judge in the Eastern District of New York enjoins the rescission of the DREAM Act, they're going to have a pretty big litigation success too. So I don't think it's quite true to say, oh, it's only the Chaldeans. But I do think that all these people being similarly situated, the fact that they went from not at risk to at risk all at once, it sort of cries out for group litigation in a way that it's most immigration cases are harder to do group litigation. So that's a piece of it too.
So there are so many things that are unique about this particular situation. Is there anything you see that might be transferable to community responses in other parts of the country?
So one of the really interesting things about this, and one of the amazing things about it, has been that, we've been trying to do intakes for the folks in detention all over the country to figure out what it is like. Do they have a lawyer? Do they need a lawyer? Do some of them actually would prefer to go back to Iraq. Not very many, but a couple. Like, what's their situation? And trying to figure out how to get lawyers into detention facilities all over the country has been this incredible challenge. And one of the really interesting things, and it's not that I didn't know this before, because I did some, but the sort of detention lawyers networking has, as the administration has ramped up the immigration detention system from, 5,000 beds to 27,000 beds to 32,000 beds to 43,000 beds, as that has happened, the infrastructure hasn't caught up, just to be clear. I mean, nowhere near it. But there is now this set of lawyers who do detention work, and getting those lawyers into detention and sort of figuring out like what access looks like. And I mean, I think one of the lessons is to, and in part, in places where that doesn't exist, the ACLU has actually been able to fill in, not to do the cases, they don't have the capacity to do that, but at least to send somebody out to talk to the detainees. So I think one of the lessons is that that kind of detention-related networking can really pay some significant dividends. And it's been casual so far, and I think it would behoove us as a community to make it a little less casual.
I don't think we've mentioned that these folks are detained in Youngstown, Ohio, which is, how far is it from here? I've been mapping it from New Era, where our other Youngstown detainee clients are.
It's like 4 hours.
About a 4-hour drive in eastern Ohio.
Not to mention that, 100 of them or so are in Youngstown, Ohio. When they win their motions to reopen, guess where they've been transferred? Because then they have to get transferred to someplace where there's a video link to the Michigan court, the Michigan Immigration Court. Guess where they get transferred? Chippewa, in Sault Ste. Marie. Youngstown is
The Upper
close
Peninsula.
compared to the Sioux, just to be clear, right? Like, because the goal of all of this is in part to get them to be far away from their communities so that they don't get the support they need to win their cases. It's outrageous.
And I also, just to add, I think it's really important in this situation and other situations when you have like a central organization where these families and these victims have a place to go. That's the reason why we opened our doors. We knew that there would be, people going from place to place, not even knowing if they're in the right place to get the right information. And it's really important for other communities to try to centralize and organize in that way. That has been really successful for us in this particular case. And we've been able to give out information, accurate information, especially since there's always, different stories going around. And it's really important to just have a central area with right information, no rumors. I think that's very helpful, especially in tight-knit communities. Thank you all. I'm sure we have questions from the audience. I wanted to open it up and give folks a chance to ask.
All right, I've got like a two-tier question here. I live in Oak Park, just north of the Detroit boundary, and we have probably about 15% of our people are Chaldeans that live in Oak Park. In fact, the second oldest Chaldean Catholic community has their church there on the grounds of the Roman church that I'm associate pastor of. I do know of one family in Oak Park who were among the numbers you mentioned that has a relative that's being detained, to be sure. Because they live next door to me, this family. Detroit has, the Detroit area has, I think, 12 Chaldean Catholic churches in the metro area. Are your attorneys working through the church congregations, the Chaldean congregations, and how supportive have they been? Many of their priests are immigrants themselves that have come here, but I think a couple of them have gone through the system and have achieved, their clergy status here in this country, if I recall right. And out of the Chaldean community, several of the families have been here at least 2 generations now, to be sure. Beside yourself, are there any other Chaldean young people studying law right now, going into, that are anticipating going into practice?
That's all for you, Nadine.
Yes, that's for me. So the first part of your question about the clergy, it was very difficult in the beginning to mobilize the church community, I guess. The Chaldean Assyrian community highly identifies with, I want to say, like they identify as Republican. And it was very hard to get the priests and the higher clergy involved on a larger scale. We initially wanted, to have them open their doors for, safe havens for a lot of these detainees, and we weren't successful in doing that. A lot of it was political, but we've also seen a lot of help. A lot of the priests are going to Youngstown and doing some type of a mass for these detainees, and helping a little bit on the ground. It's been a little challenge in that aspect, I guess. And yes, there are a lot of young Chaldean students who are pursuing law. I think I had 12 in my class from Wayne State Law, and my partner Nora has also graduated from here, so she helps me run the clinic as well. So we're seeing a growing in it. I didn't even start in immigration. I was doing general work for refugees and immigrants, very surfacey work just to help them resettle and navigate the legal system. So I was kind of pushed into the immigration world after this massive raid that happened.
One of my students heard that this was all going on. She was off in New Orleans, actually doing a summer job in New Orleans, and I didn't know her. She's my student now, but I didn't know her then. She called me up and she said, "So I'll leave my summer job right now and just work full time on this case if you need me. Do you need me?" And I said, "You should keep your summer job." But yes, like we have all kinds of stuff that you could do. And why the intense interest? And she said, "Well, I'm Chaldean. These are my neighbors who are getting jailed and deported. And I speak Aramaic and I speak pretty good Arabic. And like, this wasn't what I went to law school for, but maybe it is what I went to law school for." So she's been great.
I just wanted to add, and I'm definitely putting my own sort of high-level generalization onto this, but the community organized a remarkable rally outside the federal courthouse here in Detroit on the day of the first hearing. And it was really only about, how many, maybe just a week or two after the detentions. And, the families were there. They had T-shirts with their missing family member, promising that people would come home. It was so moving. And there were a lot of speeches. And a pattern I saw in the speeches, and Nadine can correct me if I'm just like making this up, was that an older generation kind of came forward to say, a mistake has been made. Mr. Trump, you've made a mistake, and we are not the community that should be treated like this. We supported you, and you've made a mistake. And a younger generation came forward and said, we should have known that we would be treated like this when he promised to treat everyone else like this. And everyone else has come to our aid and shared their lawyers and shared their insights and shared their resources and shared their knowledge of how you buy a detention phone card. And maybe we need to change our politics a little bit too when we catch up to the human rights situation. So, as very much an outsider to the community, that was a pattern that I saw.
Yeah, that's true. the Chaldean Assyrian community was very supportive of the Trump administration. They became single-issue voters, very based on the situation going on in the homeland. They saw themselves as being extinct, soon to be extinct. Where would our language go? Will our children know what Chaldean Assyrians are? And that's what they voted on. They took his word, and they saw it, really, really turn around on them. And I think that's why this has been, very enlightening to the community, to understand that, you're not distinct. If you're different, you need to watch your back, So I think that has been a very, very important lesson learned in our community.
Can I just ask, in terms of winning the cases, is the genocide declaration critical to the fact that you've been able to win these cases? And the genocide declaration was what, 2 years ago?
So the genocide declaration is super helpful. I don't know if it's critical exactly. The cases proceed in a sort of 1-2 manner. So part one is, why is the situation different now than it was when your final order of removal was entered? And so for that, the basic argument is, my final order, the median age of the final orders in these cases is 10 years ago. That's median. Some of them are later, some of them are earlier. Most of the people who had those final orders had been here for years and years before they got them. One of the lessons of this case is, if you're eligible to naturalize, you need to naturalize so that when you do something boneheaded, you can't lose status, right? All right, put that off to one side. So we've got people who 10 years ago had a final order entered, and the first thing they have to do is say, what's different now? And on that, the declaration of genocide is totally key, right? Because it's recent and it's very sharp. But then, having gotten the case reopened, you then have to win on something that says, not why didn't you present it before, but what's the answer now? And on that, it's more individuated, I think. It's a little hard to tell. And a lot of the people who have been winning cases have actually not been winning on CAT claims at all. Very few of them so far are winning on CAT claims. What they've
CAT claims being?
Convention Against Torture. What they're winning on is the stuff they didn't assert the last time because they didn't think they were ever going to get deported. So they're winning on the argument that the crime that rendered them deportable didn't actually render them deportable. It wasn't the right kind of crime. Or on one of them won on derivative citizenship. And I mean, there's a variety of different, they're winning on the normal sort of gamut of immigration law because the last time they were up, there was no reason for them to work so hard to avoid being deported because they weren't going to get deported. So on the reopened cases, I would say that some are winning on genocide kinds of things. 2/3 of them aren't Chaldean, just to be clear, right? And we want them to win too. We think that they're also going to be in deep trouble in Iraq, and that genocide declaration doesn't help them one iota. So some of them will win on regular immigration grounds. Some of them will win on persecution and torture. And it's possible some of them will lose, but so far, not.
Just also repeat why they had confidence that they wouldn't be deported.
Because no one was getting deported.
Because it was just a policy of the federal government that
We're not deporting
even
people
though you
to
had
Iraq.
a final
No, that
order.
I would call it a policy of the federal government. It's not so clear. Iraq wasn't taking them. I mean, that's why they weren't getting deported. Iraq wasn't taking them. It's not really that clear what the policy of the federal government was. I don't want to speak to that. I don't really know. What I can say is that Iraq was on the list of recalcitrant countries that refused to take nationals with final orders of removal who didn't have passports. And they just wouldn't take them. And when they won't take them, they won't take them. And then you can't just fly a plane to Baghdad and set it down and say, okay, go. Like, you can't do that. So, yeah.
They've tried. But.
They have tried. It's true.
Thanks. So I'm sort of really fascinated by the notion of how the community came to see themselves as part of a broader immigration struggle. I'm curious, though, when it comes down to actual litigation, it must be a fairly high temptation to spin a narrative of a deserving community and a particularly deserving community. I'm just guessing, and I'm just curious to what extent you have how you sort of thought through that problem as it presents itself in actual litigation and having to make arguments about deserving communities versus not. And this is a particularly sympathetic one, the fact that you have Christians, and how that all plays into the actual arguments made in front of judges.
So in some ways, this is a particularly deserving community. We can tell a story about Chaldean Christians and genocide and so on. And there are people who support this effort for that precise reason, right? And I like support. So that's good. That said, we have filed a putative class action representing hundreds of non-Chaldeans. And so, having taken that on, it would be unethical for us to, like, spin a story that's all about the Chaldeans, right? Like that, it would just be wrong. And if we were going to do that, then we would have had to narrow our class to represent only those people, and that would have been a very different approach to the litigation. The other thing is that there's always this good immigrant, bad immigrant way of talking about immigrants. I think, Susan and I have this conversation all the time about how we don't want to be in the good immigrant, bad immigrant language. Most of the people arrested in June, not all, but most, came here in status and lost status because they committed deportable offenses. And so, which, pause for one moment, may not have been deportable offenses if they'd only been represented and been able, right? So maybe they weren't really deportable offenses, but these are not the stories that sometimes people tell about the dreamers, right? Crime-free, college students, all of that stuff. We have very few class members who have not committed at least some dumb crime. Now, some of them are just dumb. We've got one named plaintiff who her crime was selling cigarettes without a license. Now, I don't know. I don't think that people should be deported to die in Iraq because they sold cigarettes without a license. But to be honest, I don't think they should be deported to die in Iraq if they've committed armed robbery either. I don't believe in deporting people to die in other countries. So we are not very tempted to do the good immigrant, bad immigrant thing because we have a very mixed class, and they are not poster children, when you really look at their histories, they are not poster children of absolutely never done anything wrong. They are not the valedictorians. For all I know, a couple of them are valedictorians, but that's not the group.
Asked.
We haven't asked because, right.
Our questionnaire is already really long.
Right. But so we're not very tempted to do good immigrant, bad immigrant for that precise reason.
Yeah, I have now a sense maybe that we've underlined the Chaldean community a lot because the Chaldean community is the most local affected community that was most vocal, active, and organized in terms of getting this litigation going, but it's not exclusively who the litigation is about, and it's certainly not exclusively who is vulnerable if deported to Iraq at this time.
There's something else that's unique about the Chaldean community, and full disclosure, my office represents the Chaldean Foundation. But what was the trigger here was that Iraq was on a list of 6, quote, Muslim countries. That the president said, we don't want people. It's about as discriminatory as you can, and un-American as you can get. It was also true, as you said, that Iraq would not accept these people. Both things were true. So the president entered into a deal. We'll take Iraq off the list of countries that can't have people come here, providing you will take people back. That was the deal, alleged deal. That was the trigger, by the way, for all these detentions, is that now Iraq will take these people back. So what some of us have been doing, legally and otherwise, my brother is a member of the House of Representatives on a bipartisan basis, has written a letter to Homeland Security saying, show us the deal. What deal? Is it in writing? Is it oral? Well, if it's oral, tell us what the terms are. This goes to the question of what protection, what are the circumstances in Iraq if in fact those people are sent back? My brother, member of Congress, and his colleagues cannot get an answer. Will not get an answer as to what's the deal, is it written, what are the terms and circumstances. That's been a focus also of my office, which represents the foundation, the Chaldean Foundation. We have filed a Freedom of Information Act request. We want to know the circumstances. This gets to the question of the torture issue, the country conditions that they're going to face. Most of the Chaldean community, by the way, in Iraq has been decimated. Most have left their homes. We cannot get our government, your government, to tell us yet what are the terms of this, quote, deal, which the president made to take Iraq off the S list. So now there's only, 5 Muslim countries left or whatever there are. So that's an important element of this, is that we cannot even get from our own government what are the terms and conditions of an agreement which has allegedly been entered into with Iraq that has now caused Iraq. So there's a lot of different circumstances between different communities. The Dreamers are different, obviously, from the Iraqi situation. There was no deal relative to the Dreamers. So there's a lot of different circumstances between communities. But I've got to tell you, the Chaldean community has linked arms with the immigration community here very, very strongly, and vice versa. This is a battle for principle here, not just for one group, but this is a battle for principle.
This is really an incredible story. Thank you for doing it. Thank you for sharing it with us today. I would think it would be very instructive to lots of folks across the country to hear what you've done. And I don't know if you have plans for writing a manual or writing a book about it or what, but I think it would be extremely helpful if that were produced.
Thank you. I mean, one thing that we have done is we've been posting all of the pleadings kind of pretty much instantly, and we share them with the broader public interest immigration bar. And so people are pretty, I mean, they're long. I grant you, they're really long. I mean, the document that we filed on Tuesday, we filed like with exhibits, it was over 500 pages of stuff on Tuesday. But you know, the writing of it was only 70 pages. But thank you. We have been trying to share it out pretty broadly, and I think when we all get to take a couple deep breaths, and especially if we win on detention, because if we win on detention, that's going to be a really big deal. If we win on detention, we're going to have to think of a way for people to capitalize on that win and to do something similar in some other friendly court environments.
I think Sabrina was going to ask us who's going to play us in the movie.
So I agree, it's an amazing story, and thanks so much for sharing it, and I agree that it should be shared even more broadly. I want to say, I mean, when you were asked about why this group and not other Latinos, it brought to my mind, well, we did have something sort of similar with family detention, for example, where it was similarly, it was all, you know, sort of Central American asylum seekers, and there was a combination of huge individual representation efforts still existing, plus impact litigation on the West Coast and on the East Coast, and a number of other measures, and with some success, although, you know, not all the way where we would like it to be. And I raise that just because, I mean, I think that's part of the joy of coming together in these kinds of events, is that I think we learn so much from one another. We see models of things that are happening in other parts of the country and realize that our impressions of the overall system are actually very regionally dictated, and we only kind of know, we think the whole immigration system is what we see in our corner of the world, of the country, and so it's really, really helpful to have these exchanges. But it also makes me think that that we should have some optimism for the idea that maybe this kind of model, it'll always be a little bit different, is starting to become more prevalent. Now you also see Southern Poverty Law Center starting up pretty broad representation projects in some of the detention centers in the Deep South. So you're starting to see more of it, and so I actually think it's important to point that out so that we feel some optimism in gray days. It really is. But also so that we can, as you say, Margot, formalize some of these networks, but also just learn from lessons from others. I wonder if you all have any thoughts about kind of the more specifics of how do you make this story known? How do you make the movie known? How do we share these experiences that are happening in pockets in a way that might lead to an even broader movement?
I'd like to do a little bit of work on detention. I mean, I feel like people are so afraid of detained cases. And the other thing is that the immigration bar is petrified of federal court. And those two things, I mean, you know, when the Supreme Court in 2001, I think, issued the Zavadas decision, they handed immigration lawyers a weapon that has gone mostly unused. Now, part of that, so Zavadas says that when an immigrant stays in a would-be immigrant, so a person with a final order of removal, has been in detention a really long time, so that it's really not looking that plausible like they're gonna be removed, that you need to spring them. That's what Zavadas says. And they need to get out of detention, because you're not supposed to be in detention for no reason. If you're in detention, it's to effectuate your removal. And if ICE isn't effectuating your removal, then they should let you out of detention. And nonetheless, the number of Zavadas claims that are counseled in this country is very, very, very small. I feel like this interaction of immigration, and that's the place where we see the most interaction of immigration court and federal court, and we're just not seeing a lot of lawyers living at that intersection. I feel like there's some opportunity there, and an opportunity for people to start doing more detained work. That, you know, there's a couple hundred detention facilities, but most of them have very few people in them. If there was somebody who could help facilitate lawyer representation of people inside each of the big ones, if there was somebody who, that's what they did at Stewart, and that's what they did at Carnes, and that's what, right? All of a sudden, lawyers could take on these cases because they wouldn't have to trek down to Carnes and get inside and waste the whole, like, there'd be some ability to do this networking. I feel like there's some real opportunity there somehow if we could figure out what it is. I haven't really got my head around what it is, but that's what I've been thinking. I mean to be the only one who talks. Because I have somebody at Youngstown.
Just one picking up on what Denise and Margot just said, which is that I too was struck, when I was listening to you, by some of the parallels to, say, the Artesia Project, to Dillian Carnes, about the project of making sure that everyone gets a lawyer. But I also remember, in contrast to Margot, you saying you're doing your best to convince the judge that this isn't going to screw up the system. That Stephen Manning writes about the Artesia Project. Our goal is to screw up the system. Our goal is to give so many people lawyers that the system can't function, because the system can't function if everybody has a lawyer. And I just want to see if anyone has thoughts about that.
But it can in the non-detained docket. Sorry.
Well, I have thoughts about that, because it's a huge challenge as we try to build sustainable nonprofit organizations that can do some of this coordinating and identifying and referring, because there is such pressure to look to public dollars where you justify the grant as promising that it will improve the function of the courts. Our office was part of the Justice AmeriCorps demonstration project for unaccompanied minors, and we were asked to sign waivers to provide what would really be confidential information about the dates and timing of screenings for forms of relief that would absolutely be prejudicial if the government were ever to access it. And we ultimately had to drop out of the program because we couldn't reach a resolution, because gathering the data in a particular way was vital to demonstrating that the project would improve the functioning of the courts. And we're not a court improvement organization. That's not our mission. And sometimes you can take dollars that are designed for court improvement and do our mission with them, which is immigrant advocacy, immigrant justice, access to legal services. But sometimes you can't. And so that is a huge challenge and temptation as you try to build structures, and it's tempting to get pure about it, but we just took another improving the function of the courts grant because it's allowed us to add 4 attorneys who are representing immigrants and doing our mission. So I don't have an answer other than that to say this question of whether we are or are not breaking the system is one that I talk out of both sides of my mouth on.
I mean, the thing to remember is that, the immigration courts, I worked for DHS for a few years, and I knew a lot about immigration systems, but I had never actually spent any time in immigration court until I was getting started on this case and some related stuff. And I started off by just spending a day in Detroit watching immigration court, which actually kind of gave them fits. They were like, "Wait, you want to what?" I said, "It's court, right? I just want to watch." And they were like, "Oh." They did eventually let me watch. But what you have to remember about immigration court is that it's not really court, right? I mean, it's sort of this weird semblance of a court, but it's not really court. I watched a trial with a guy in detention in Monroe County in by video link to Detroit, where he only spoke Spanish, and they only translated, the interpreter only interpreted the direct questions that were going to him. So he watched his trial without understanding anything that was happening and without his lawyer next to him to explain to him or to ask his view on what should happen next. That's not court. That's a scandal. So we have to remember that immigration court is a scandal. And if we're going to improve it, we need to make it less scandalous as well as make it more efficient.
Yeah, I mean, And like, what is the purpose of the court? You know, I just got a report from a pro bono attorney from Jenner and Block, who we helped, interview a family in detention in Calhoun County, take a case. And she reported that the family won their asylum case and that Judge Jebsen on the record said, "You absolutely would not have won this case without a lawyer." And that means the system worked. Did it take up more resources for them to go to trial instead of signing a stipulated order? Yeah, it did. So I think we improved the system, even if we used up more resources.
So one more question.
You do, Bob, because of the...
Oh, okay. So Margot, right now you're 10 for 10 in immigration court.
Not me. The people who are doing those cases are 10 for 10.
So is it really such a scandal if things come out when people are properly represented?
Things work better when there are lawyers. I guess my point is it's a system that what John just said is true. If everybody was represented, the system might break. In the same way that the criminal justice system might break if nobody pled. Right? That part's not unique to immigration court. Yeah, the system works a lot better if there are lawyers, and it works an awful lot better if the lawyers are competent.
That's another panel, but...
On that note, yes. On that note, I want to thank our panelists again for this great conversation.